When actors turn down roles that end up winning an Oscar, we tend to blame them for their choice, forgetting that the same roles have a different look with different actors. In this video, we're looking at 7 actors who turned down Oscar winning roles and how it impacted their careers. Let's take it from the top. Number 1, John Travolta. By the early 1990s, John Travolta's career had already seen enormous highs and confusing lows. After dominating the 70s with Saturday Night Fever and Grease, the 80s brought a string of flops and middling roles. Travolta remained a recognized name, but the kind of roles that could transform his career seemed scarce. And then came the script for Forrest Gump. To Travolta and everyone at the time, it was unusual, a sprawling tale spanning decades, mixing comedy, drama, and a deeply human story about a man who stumbles through history while keeping a pure heart. For most actors, it was an irresistible opportunity. For Travolta, however, it didn't click. It also arrived at a moment when Travolta was actively trying to recalibrate what his next chapter would look like. So he passed. The choice he made would quietly reset the trajectory of 2 careers, but the consequences wouldn't become clear until much later. And that's the key thing here. This didn't feel like a crossroads yet. The reality was Travolta needed a hit, but he also needed credibility. He'd already been nominated for an Oscar once, for Saturday Night Fever, but that nomination was over a decade old, tied to a different version of himself. Instead, he signed on to Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, a bold gamble that promised edge, reinvention, and a complete career pivot. Fortunately for him, the film didn't just revive his career, it redefined it. Meanwhile, Tom Hanks stepped into Forrest Gump and turned the role into a cultural phenomenon. And here's where the story gets more complicated. His performance as Vincent Vega earned him a Best Actor nomination, placing him directly in competition with Tom Hanks, who was nominated for Forrest Gump at the 67th Academy Awards in 1995. And to top it off, both Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump were in the running for Best Picture. Hanks won the Best Oscar in 1995, a moment that permanently linked the character to him. This was his second consecutive Best Actor win, having won the previous year for Philadelphia. Travolta, meanwhile, marked a dramatic return to prestige and proved his versatility. Yet the shadow of Forrest Gump lingers. Even today, debates still go on. I still believe Travolta and Pulp Fiction should have won the Oscars they were nominated for. Others wonder how different Forrest Gump might have felt, with his sharper edge and natural irony. After Pulp Fiction, Travolta's career entered a patchwork of reinvention and stability. Films like Get Shorty and Face Off restored commercial and critical credibility, while later roles, including Hairspray, highlighted his adaptability. He achieved sustained relevance, but never quite regained the cultural dominance he might have commanded as Gump. The decision, whether intentional or instinctual, didn't derail him. It redirected him. Turning down Forrest Gump indirectly led to Pulp Fiction, and that nomination resecured his place in Hollywood. One question that lingers isn't whether Travolta made the wrong choice, but what if he had said yes? Would it have given him the Oscar, or cost him the reinvention that followed? And so, from Travolta's story, we talk about a different type of refusal, one rooted in moral and creative considerations. Number 2, Michelle Pfeiffer. Around the same time Travolta's career was experiencing lows, Michelle Pfeiffer's career was the opposite. She was one of Hollywood's most respected leading actresses of the time. She balanced commercial success with critical credibility, moving easily between dramas, romances, and psychological roles. Films like Dangerous Liaisons and The Fabulous Baker Boys established her as both glamorous and intellectually formidable. So when the script for The Silence of the Lambs arrived, Pfeiffer was already operating from a position of strength. She didn't need the role to prove herself. At first glance, Clarence Starling was a career-defining opportunity, a young FBI trainee navigating a male-dominated institution while confronting one of cinema's most terrifying antagonists. But Pfeiffer hesitated. The film's explicit violence and disturbing subject matter raised concerns, and she didn't feel personally attached to the role. Ultimately, she declined the role, choosing projects she felt aligned more comfortably with her personal boundaries. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable decision. Few could predict how the film would be received. Jodie Foster accepted the part, and The Silence of the Lambs became a cultural phenomenon. At the 64th Academy Awards in March 1992, the film swept the major Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actress for Foster. The success instantly elevated Clarence Starling, into one of the most iconic characters in film history. Pfeiffer, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines as a role she had considered but walked away from became synonymous with prestige and fearlessness. In the years that followed, Pfeiffer's career remained strong, though its rhythm shifted. She continued to deliver acclaimed performances in films like Batman Returns, The Age of Innocence, and Dangerous Minds. Yet, the industry around her changed. As Hollywood's appetite for complex adult dramas waned, so did the frequency of roles offering the same depth and impact. While Pfeiffer never lacked talent or respect, she gradually stepped back from the center of awards conversation. I believe her decision was one rooted in ethics and self protection rather than career desperation, and unlike some missed opportunities, this was not a rejection of quality, but of tone and content. Pfeiffer preserved her personal dignity and longevity, even as another actress claimed one of the most celebrated performances of the decade. And from her moral hesitation, we shift to something far more personal, a choice shaped by grief, timing, and the weight of history. Number 3. Liam Neeson. In the late 2000s, Liam Neeson occupied a rare space in Hollywood. He was widely respected, Oscar nominated for Schindler's List, and viewed as a serious dramatic actor, even as his career took an unexpected turn into late life action stardom with Taken. That dual identity made him unusual. He was credible for prestige projects and bankable in commercial ones. So when Steven Spielberg began assembling the cast of Lincoln, Neeson was the original actor attached to the role. For a time, he wasn't just a candidate, he was Lincoln. At first, the casting made sense. Neeson had the physical presence, the gravitas, and the historical weight audiences associate with Lincoln. Spielberg developed the project with Neeson in mind for years, long before cameras rolled. But as the film edged closer to production, something shifted. Neeson began to feel that he had lived with the role for too long. He worried that his performance would feel overly familiar, even inert, that the mystery of discovery was gone. Eventually, he made the call to step away. That decision quietly changed everything. Daniel Day-Lewis replaced him, and Lincoln became one of the defining prestige films of the decade. Day-Lewis won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 2013, his third Oscar, and the performance was immediately canonized. This turn of events would raise a very important question. Would the film have carried the same weight without Day-Lewis's transformational intensity? And just as importantly, would Neeson's more restrained approach have reframed Lincoln as something quieter and more human? Well, for Neeson, turning down Lincoln moved his career decisively in another direction. He doubled down on action and thriller roles, becoming an unlikely but highly reliable box office draw well into his 60s. Films like Non-Stop, The Gray, and Run All Night kept him visible, relevant, and financially successful. While he largely exited the Oscar conversation, he gained something else: longevity in a genre that rarely welcomes actors his age. There's also a personal dimension that can't be separated from the decision. Neeson has spoken openly about how grief reshaped his priorities following the death of his wife, Natasha Richardson. Prestige for prestige's sake no longer held the same appeal. Stability, momentum, and emotional distance mattered more. In that context, walking away from Lincoln feels less like a miscalculation and more like an act of self awareness. And from a role surrendered out of creative instinct, we move next to a decision shaped by representation, history, and the burden of being first. Number 4. Angela Bassett. At the turn of the century, Angela Bassett had already done something very few actors ever achieve. She had become a symbol of excellence. Her work in What's Love Got to Do with It earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress in 1994, instantly placing her in the highest tier of performers. She was trusted with historical figures, emotionally demanding roles, and characters that carried cultural weight. So when Monsters Ball began circulating, Bassett wasn't just a contender for Letitia Musgrove. She was the first choice. On paper, the role looked like another awards opportunity. Letitia is a grieving widow, living in poverty, navigating racism, trauma, and devastating loss. It's the kind of emotionally brutal part the Academy often responds to, but Bassett read the script and paused. What troubled her wasn't the darkness of the character, it was the framing. She felt the role leaned too heavily into degradation and humiliation, particularly in how Letitia's suffering was positioned for audience consumption. Bassett later said she couldn't reconcile the character's sexual vulnerability and despair with the way black pain was being portrayed. That decision opened a door for Halle Berry. Berry accepted the role, delivered a raw, fearless performance, and in 2002 became the first black woman to ever win the Academy Award for Best Actress. It's impossible to talk about this case without sitting in that tension. Bassett didn't just turn down an Oscar winning role, she turned down a role that made history. And that raises an unavoidable question. If Bassett had accepted, would the cultural movement have landed differently? Would history still have been made the same way? After Monsters Ball, Bassett's career didn't collapse, it recalibrated. She continued working steadily, often choosing roles that emphasized strength, authority, and dignity. Films like Aquila and the Bee, and later Olympus Has Fallen, shifted her into matriarchal and leadership positions. On television, she flourished, earning Emmy nominations and critical praise. And then came Black Panther in 2018, where she played Queen Ramonda, a role that reintroduced her to a new generation and reaffirmed her cultural stature. But the irony is, Bassett remained in Oscar talks for decades, respected but unrewarded. While the role she declined became a milestone for someone else, I don't know if she regretted her choice, but Bassett stood by it, repeatedly emphasizing that success couldn't come at the cost of self-respect. That stance alone is worth my respect. And years later, the Academy finally circled back. Bassett earned another Oscar nomination for Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, in 2023, and later received an honorary Academy Award the next year, acknowledging her lifetime contribution to cinema. The statue came late, but the consistency was always there. And from a choice rooted in principle and representation, we move next to a very different kind of refusal, one driven by exhaustion, reinvention, and a quiet retreat from stardom. Number 5. Hugh Grant. Around the same time Neeson was considering Lincoln, Hugh Grant was at an unusual crossroads. For nearly 2 decades, he had been one of the most recognizable romantic leads in the world. 4 Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill, Love Actually. His screen persona was so firmly established that it had become both his brand and his trap. Grant himself was increasingly vocal about the discomfort with acting, the press cycle, and the machinery of prestige filmmaking. He wasn't chasing awards anymore. In fact, he was actively stepping away. It was at this moment the King's Speech enters the picture. The role of King George VI was being cast, and Grant was among the actors considered early on. On paper, it made sense. British, upper-class cadence, emotional representation, internal struggle. This was a chance to completely reframe how the industry saw him, but instead of leaning in, Grant leaned out. He passed on the role, later explaining that he felt tired, disillusioned, and uninterested in the demands of another serious lead. At the time, it didn't feel like a dramatic gamble, it just felt like opting out. His decision shifted the project toward Colin Firth, and once Firth stepped in, everything accelerated. The King's Speech became a prestige juggernaut, premiering in 2010 to overwhelming acclaim. Firth's portrayal of a reluctant monarch battling a stammer wasn't just praised, it dominated award season. He won Best Actor at the 2011 Academy Awards, alongside wins at the BAFTAs, Golden Globes, and SAG Awards. The role Grant declined became the defining performance of Firth's career. The irony of this turn of events is Grant had never won an Oscar before this moment. This wasn't a case of an established winner stepping aside. It was a rare, late-career opportunity to completely rewrite his legacy, and yet, he didn't seem to look back. While the industry crowned Firth, Grant quietly pivoted. In the years that followed, Grant didn't disappear, he transformed. He began taking supporting roles, often leaning into darker, sharper, or more self-aware characters. Cloud Atlas, Paddington 2, Florence Foster Jenkins, The Gentleman. These weren't Oscar plays, but they were deliberate. He reemerged as a character actor with bite, unpredictability, and comic edge. Interestingly, it's this later phase that earned him renewed critical respect, including a Golden Globe nomination for Florence Foster Jenkins. Grant never later won an Oscar, and notably, he never chased one. His post-King's Speech career suggests something else entirely: control. He chose projects on his terms, avoided the prestige treadmill, and reshaped his public image without needing validation from the Academy. Still, the question lingers. If Grant had said yes, if he'd embraced the discomfort, the discipline, the grind, would that gold statue have his name on it instead? We'll never know. And next, we move to an actor whose withdrawal wasn't about exhaustion or reinvention, but timing, family, and a role that would redefine modern method acting. Number 6. Gael Garcia Bernal. Still in the early 2010s, around the same time Neeson and Grant unintentionally changed Oscar's history with their decision, Gael Garcia Bernal also did in his own little way. At that point in his career, he occupied a very different space than most Oscar adjacent actors. He wasn't chasing Hollywood validation or positioning himself for prestigious awards. Instead, he was balancing international projects, producing, directing, and building a career that moved fluidly between Mexican cinema, American indies, and television. He had credibility, range, and respect, but he wasn't operating on the usual award season conveyor belt. It was also at that time that Dallas Buyers Club began taking shape. The project had been in development for years, passing through multiple rewrites and casting changes. When it finally gained momentum, Bernal was attached to play Rayon, a transgender woman, an AIDS patient, whose emotional arc would become the film's center of gravity. The role was demanding, physically transformative, emotionally raw, and politically charged. This wasn't a safe prestige role. It came with real personal and professional exposure. Then the shift happened. Bernal withdrew from the project shortly before filming. The reason wasn't creative disagreement or fear of controversy. It was timing and family. His wife was pregnant, and Bernal chose to step away rather than commit to an intense shoot during that period. It was a quiet decision made without drama, but it redirected the entire trajectory of the film. Jared Leto stepped in to replace him. Once Dallas Buyers Club premiered in 2013, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Leto's performance as Rayon dominated the conversation. It won Best Supporting Actor at the 2014 Academy Awards, along with Golden Globe, SAG, and Critics' Choice wins. The role Bernal had nearly played became one of the most talked about and awarded performances of the decade. But same as Grant, Bernal had never won an Oscar before this point, and this role, unlike many others, was positioned squarely in the Academy's sweet spot: transformative, tragic, socially relevant, and emotionally expansive. It was the kind of part that can permanently alter how an actor is perceived, but still, Bernal had no regret. The aftermath tells an interesting story. Rather than chasing a replacement prestige role, Bernal doubled down on creative control. He starred in Mozart in the Jungle, earning a Golden Globe win in 2016. He voiced Hector in Coco, a global cultural phenomenon. He continued directing, producing, and working across borders, maintaining a career defined by flexibility rather than awards positioning. Bernal still hasn't won an Oscar yet, but I don't believe it's a metric guiding his decisions. Still, the question lingers quietly in the background. If timing had been different, if he had stayed, would Dallas Buyers Club have rewritten his Hollywood standing entirely? And next, we arrive at the clearest cautionary tale of them all: an actor at the absolute peak of his power, a role written specifically for him, and a single decision that marked a turning point he would later call his greatest regrets. Number 7. Burt Reynolds. Back in the early 1980s, Burt Reynolds wasn't just a movie star, he was the movie star. For several consecutive years, he was the biggest box office draw in the world, powered by crowd pleasers like Smokey and the Bandit and the Cannonball Run. He had money, leverage, and something even rare in Hollywood: the freedom to choose comfort over reinvention. That was Burt Reynolds. He didn't need an Oscar movie, he was the movie. It was at this point in his career that terms of endearment enter the picture. James L. Brooks wrote the role of retired astronaut Garrett Breedlove specifically with Reynolds in mind. It was a tonal shift, quieter, sharper, and more emotionally exposed than the roles that had made Reynolds a superstar. But attaching Reynolds would also help get the film financed. For a moment, everything lined up. This was a role designed to reframe how audiences and the industry saw him. Then came the choice. Reynolds turned the part down to make Stroker Ace, a NASCAR comedy, directed by his longtime collaborator and close friend Hal Needham. Loyalty played a major role. So did familiarity. Reynolds knew how those movies worked, knew the audience, and knew the rhythm. At the time, terms of endearment was a risk. No one knew it would become an awards juggernaut. From Reynolds' vantage point, sticking with a proven formula probably felt like the safer move. What followed was a stark split-screen moment in film history. Stroker Ace was released in the summer of 1983 and flopped, both critically and commercially. A few months later, Terms of Endearment opened to massive acclaim. It went on to win 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Jack Nicholson, who replaced Reynolds, won Best Supporting Actor in 1984 for the very role written for Burt. The aftermath was slow but unmistakable. A run of commercial disappointments followed. Injuries, financial troubles, and declining box office trust pushed Reynolds out of the leading man status. By the late 1980s, he had shifted to television, steady work, respected work, but a clear step down from where he'd been. His eventual comeback in Boogie Nights earned him his first and only Oscar nomination, but even that came with bitterness and conflict. It is at this moment where hindsight becomes unavoidable. Reynolds had not won an Oscar before this decision, and he would never win one afterward. Years later, he openly called turning down Terms of Endearment the biggest regret of his career. He didn't soften it, he said it outright. The unresolved question lingers. If Reynolds had said yes, if he had taken the risk instead of the familiar, would his entire 1980s look different? And that's why Reynolds stands apart from every other case on this list. For most actors, saying no redirected their careers. For Burt Reynolds, it marked the moment the direction changed without him realizing it. Oscar-winning roles feel monumental in hindsight, but they're still just moments, snapshots in careers shaped by hundreds of decisions. Many roles have been rejected by actors, and these are no different. The only reason these decisions require a video is because it came with a statue. What ultimately matters isn't the statue, but the judgment behind the choice. Some actors trusted timing, values, or instinct, and thrived. Others misread the moment and paid a lasting price. That tension is the real story, not the gold. So, which decision do you think mattered most? Which was justified, and which was absolutely the right call? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video and want more breakdowns on lesser known Hollywood stories, like and subscribe to always get notified.